Welcome to episode 187, originally published on the 19th of February 2026. In his book Science Fiction: The 100 Best Novels, David Pringle aptly described A Canticle for Leibowitz as a beautifully written novel, rich in character and ironic detail, and at the same time funny and sad. Published in 1959, this book was the only novel published by Walter M. Miller Jr. during his lifetime. One of the most highly praised science fiction novels of the 1950s, A Canticle for Leibowitz is in part Miller's reflection on his traumatic experiences in World War II, his Catholic faith, and his fears of nuclear conflict. It's also a stark warning about the dangers of both ignorance and knowledge, and an exploration of humankind's capacity for creativity and destruction. On the 15th of February 1944, the United States military bombed the Benedictine Abbey at Monte Cassino, southeast of Rome. Mistakenly believing that the abbey was being occupied by German troops, the Americans dropped over 1,000 tons of explosives on the structure, which had been built in 529 AD. The abbey was obliterated. The Cardinal Secretary of State described the act as a colossal blunder, a piece of gross stupidity. One life permanently changed by the bombing was that of Walter M. Miller Jr. He was a tail gunner whose aircraft was one of those which destroyed the abbey at Monte Cassino, and he was profoundly affected by it. Joe Haldeman, author of The Forever War, wrote that Miller had post-traumatic stress disorder for 30 years before it had a name. After the war, Miller studied engineering and converted to Catholicism in 1947. Between 1951 and 1957, he published over 36 science fiction stories, which were often influenced by his faith. Of these, 3 were gathered and adapted into the only novel published in his lifetime, A Canticle for Leibowitz, published in 1959. Long one of the most celebrated science fiction novels of the 1950s, the book deals with the efforts of monks in what was once New Mexico to preserve knowledge in the millennia after a devastating nuclear war. Told in 3 parts, each separated by 6 centuries, A Canticle for Leibowitz is a powerful meditation on knowledge, faith, progress, and the hope and risks that come with science and technology. A Canticle for Leibowitz is a post-apocalyptic novel focusing on the long, slow recovery of civilization after a nuclear exchange at some point in the 20th century. At the centre of the book is the Albertian Order of Leibowitz, based at an abbey in the deserted wasteland of post-nuclear New Mexico. The monks there venerate I.E. Leibowitz, an electrical engineer who survived the flame deluge and sought to preserve knowledge during the mass book burnings and purges of intellectuals that followed. This is a fix-up novel made up of 3 parts, a common form in the 1950s. Each part is an expansion of a story published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, or F&SF, between 1955 and 1957. Perhaps surprisingly, it didn't dawn on Miller that he was writing a serialized novel until he was writing the 3rd part. In Fiat Homo, a 26th century novice stumbles on a fallout shelter which contains a blueprint which Leibowitz had worked on. Brother Francis Girard makes it his life's work to copy and try to understand this relic, a mission which causes great trouble for him inside and outside the abbey, but which also presents new hope for the future. In Fiat Lux, it's 3174, and the abbey is surrounded by petty fiefdoms. Fontadeo, a secular scientist from the city of Texarkana, visits the abbey while regional tensions are on the rise. Finally, Fiat Voluntas Tua is set in 3781, and new states have far surpassed the technical achievements of the distant 20th century. In the time of Abbot Zerchi, the abbey must confront the possibility of a second nuclear conflict. Writing in the Science Fiction Encyclopedia, Brian Stableford and David Langford stated that familiar definitions of SF imply that there's nothing more alien to its concerns than religion. However, they go on to identify a spectacular boom in stories which cut straight to the heart of theological matters in the period following World War II. They describe A Canticle for Leibowitz as the single most impressive work of this period. The monks in the novel practice a sort of corrupted form of Catholicism, shaped by the nuclear disaster of the Flame Deluge. Their community is steeped in Latin scripture, but has its own saints, rites, and rituals. In the surprisingly funny Fiat Homo, Miller exploits this for some dark humour, in one instance articulating the logic of nuclear deterrence in the language of the Bible. Only because the enemies have such a thing have we devised this for thee, in order that they may know that thou hast it also, and fear to strike. See to it, my lord, that thou fearest them as much as they shall now fear thee, that none may unleash this dread thing which we have wrought. Miller's own faith and deep knowledge of Catholicism is evident throughout the novel. The book displays a deep respect for the religious vocation, and for the longevity and patience of Christian institutions, the only ones able to survive the catastrophe. Fiat Voluntas Tua, in particular, is a deep exploration of faith, which deals with the nature of religious calling, the relationship between religious and secular institutions, and the Catholic attitude to suicide, all in a science-fictional context. Early on in Fiat Lux, the scientist Thondadeo asks Abbot Dom Paolo, how can a great and wise civilization have destroyed itself so completely? This is one of the key questions which animates A Canticle for Leibowitz. Across the arc of its 3 parts, the novel suggests that the human race is trapped in a tragic cycle of invention and destruction, capable of incredible feats, but doomed to undo them in atomic hellfire, senselessly wasting billions of lives time and again. As Abbot Zurchi muses in the novel's final part, have we no choice but to play the phoenix in an unending sequence of rise and fall? One monk's initial answer to the scholar's question is to suggest that the people of the 20th century were materially great and materially wise and nothing else. This implies a spiritual lack, a spiritual failing in humankind. Over the centuries, the monks become the guardians of technical knowledge they cannot understand. The novel invites the question: if those at the Abbey understood the great promise and the dire threat of the treasured fragments of a dead civilization, would they keep them or cast them into the fire? It's striking that the loss of worldly knowledge begun by the Flame Deluge, the nuclear war, is completed by mobs deliberately seeking out and destroying written information, and hunting down first intellectuals and then anyone who could read. In this aspect, Miller's novel connects with Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, published in 1953, also about a mania for illiterate simplification. In Bradbury's work, book burning does not follow a nuclear war, but rather precedes it. A Canticle for Leibowitz is one chain and a cycle of many other SF novels dealing with the tension between faith and progress, including Pavan, published in 1968 by Keith Roberts, and The Cloud Walker, published in 1978 by Edmund Cooper. Following the publication of A Canticle for Leibowitz, Walter M. Miller Jr. ceased to publish. He experienced depression and eventually became a recluse, allowing no one to see him, not even his agent. Some months after the death of his wife, Miller ended his own life on the 9th of January 1996. At Miller's request, the writer Terry Bisson completed St. Leibowitz and the Wild Horse Woman, Miller's relatively little-known sequel to his classic novel. In the SFE, John Clute reflects that the original novel remained a singleton for decades and retains that autonomy for most readers. Certainly A Canticle for Leibowitz retains and deserves its classic status, in part as a humane and troubling examination of humankind's linked capacity to create and to destroy. Thanks for listening. For more classic science fiction reviews, visit andyjohnson.xyz. You can also find the show on YouTube and follow updates on Blue Sky. In both cases, just search Classic SF with Andy Johnson. Finally, to get in touch, use the contact form on my site or hit the link in the episode description to send a text message.